Are you struggling to create an intentional headspace? Unable to connect deeper with yourself? Come, and together, let's address the elephant in the room. I'm your host, Sinead Roche, and this is the Uncomfortable Podcast. Unfortunately, throughout life, we can end up hurting other people, whether that be in arguments or whether that be because of our actions. We end up hurting people, and it's very uncomfortable to acknowledge that and to take accountability for that, and also to be responsible for your own actions and to take ownership for that. It's really uncomfortable to sit with that feeling because, it's not a feeling that you want to sit with. Some of us might feel guilty. Some of us might even be really defensive when that happens. And it's just, no one wants to be in that space where you've actually hurt another person, even if in the moment it was intentional to hurt the person, or even especially a person you care, who you care about, even if in the moment that's what you wanted to do because you might have been lashing out of anger, or lashing out of because you're hurt or something like this. At the end, when you really reflect back on it, I don't think you ending up in those situations or being in those situations because of yourself or because the situation just led to be like that. And I think it also really internally messes with you because especially if you think that you're such a, I'm such an upstanding person and you have perhaps, I wouldn't say a high view of yourself, but just a good view of yourself. And you go through these incidences and these things happen. It's just oh my God, you gotta be kidding me. There's no way I did this. You kind of also in denial with it. And that's why I want to talk about today, being accountable for your actions and also understanding that you have to, take a step back and understand that there are going to be consequences for those actions and that you can't control that shit, And what I mean by that is when you're apologizing to a person and you're accepting that you've hurt them, that's one step. But the other step of that is also you can't control what happens after that because it's on them, if they want to forgive you or however that is going to play itself out within that relationship. Now, let's talk about why no one wants to be accountable for their actions. I think the biggest reasons, and even reflecting on mine, my own, are sometimes we just don't want to be wrong about something, and that's really I would say a petty version of it. Obviously there's more and we'll be getting into those, but nobody wants to be in the wrong as well. It's kind of I don't know, you kind of have to then put your ego aside, which is really hard for some of us to do, but also always necessary in these cases, and especially when you care about the people who you are affecting, and even when you don't really care about them because human decency, But you kind of have to walk with your head between your knees, and hung low. And it's just man, I messed up. And it's different when in comparison, just messing up with yourself. Now, you've actually hurt another person. It's just well, and I think we make it a lot harder, to get to those moments, even though it might feel a low for us. I feel we make it a lot harder to apologize, and to, I guess, show up in that relationship even when we weren't able to, and that's what ended up getting us there. We make it a lot harder when we avoid taking ownership for our mistakes and ownership for our response, in ownership for what we've done to the person. And when we also just negate their feelings and what's happening with them and how we've impacted them. And this has a lot to do with it's a really just uncomfortable feeling to be with. You don't want to acknowledge that you've done this to a person. As I said before, it could also go against your own belief that you have about yourself already. And this ties back into the cognitive dissonance theory, which is where you might think that you're internally a good person. And I guarantee you probably are a good person. But then there's just some actions that also go against that. And it's just that belief within you is now being challenged and you don't know which direction to turn. You want to still stay in your mind that you're a good person, which you probably still are, but now you have to confront that this action has happened, that this was your behavior. And that's also really unsettling. And but I think that's just always going to be a very normal part about it. And I'll also talk about why I kind of like that aspect of it in a moment. And sometimes it's also like one of the reasons why we don't like to accept that kind of ownership. We rather deny rather than having to deal with the consequences, as I've mentioned, because at that point, like when you have hurt another person, it's up to them, like, you know, after hopefully you've apologized, hopefully you've made amends, and you've kind of changed your behavior, at least like set out a plan to change your behavior. It's kind of up to them, like whether or not they want to accept that apology. And another aspect of this, like coming from an external point of view, is that sometimes we're also really afraid to accept this because we might also like change other people's perception about us, you know, and that's not something we can control. Other people can look at us after this like action and be like, she's actually like a terrible person, you know, like why would you do that to them? And even if you have like all the justification for it, you know, you still hurt that person. And sometimes, yes, other people's perceptions about you then do change, and that's just not something you control. So there's many reasons as to why we don't like to be accountable for our own actions, don't like to accept the consequences of things. And I would hope that the people who are on, like, who are listening to this podcast, I mean, I think you're trying to be emotionally mature and emotionally resilient. But sometimes another reason, like, why we just don't do these, or like why certain people, like, they don't take responsibility for what they've done, is because they just don't have it in them. And they might not be emotionally mature enough to process what's happening, especially like in a constructive manner. Because obviously, like, even though you might be the person who's hurt another person, when you acknowledge that shit, it can definitely tear you down as well. And we'll talk about how to, you know, move around this as well in a bit. But that could also be another reason why. And then pride and ego also getting in the way. Like, you not wanting to be in the wrong so much that you're just in denial about it and invalidating someone's feelings, and you just don't want to step over yourself. That's also might be another reason why you might be hesitating, or other people who you know might be hesitating to be accountable for their own actions. But unfortunately, it's really important that we take accountability and that we own up to our own stuff. And I think it's really important because then we're able to acknowledge then when we've messed up with people, and especially in relationships in any capacity, whether that be like romantic, friendship, whether that be like even in business or something like this, or even like in a project or something like this, being able to own up to it and take accountability and be like, hey, listen, I actually did mess up and I am sorry. I think it allows for more honesty in that relationship, and more vulnerability, because yes, taking accountability, even though you're the one who messed up, in this case, like, that is a vulnerable moment, because that is you not letting your ego and your pride protect you, you know, from the reality of the situation of it. And I think that creates stronger like relationships and more trust, because you're being so open and honest. And I think when you're able to acknowledge that, and also acknowledge that you've hurt another person, then you're also allowing space for those emotions to be talked about and expressed. And I think you just show up as a stronger person. I mean, I know it might seem like it's like a quote unquote weak thing to do sometimes, to like actually be like, you know, I messed up, because maybe that was a weak point, like, that happened, and that's the reason why certain things came about. But I think it's a really strong moment where you're able to just be like, you know, I'm going to take it. I'm going to take ownership of my things, and I'm not going to avoid it, because avoiding things is so much easier. And I mean, but that doesn't make great relationships, and avoiding it doesn't make you, I guess, the best person necessarily, even though you might have your reasons for it. But I think definitely if your goal is to reconnect with this person and like find a solution or just make amends, then taking accountability and owning up to it can definitely help to strengthen that trust. I think another reason why it is really important for us and our own selves is because it allows us to be like more emotionally resilient. And what I mean by this, like why it's important for us, is because obviously like you're going to face a lot of internal turmoil where it's like, no, but like I didn't mean to do this. Like it's with, I don't know, like you're kind of like fighting with like the justification of why you did this, like an intention of why you did this, with also like what's happened, what are the consequences, what's like the results of this, how did this actually play itself out. And definitely, yes, you'll get into that point where it's just like, oh man, I'm a terrible person. Like some of us can actually internalize that to the point where it's just like, I'm a terrible person, rather than I've done something that's bad, you know? But when we're able to own up to it, and obviously like I said, it's internal conflict, but when you're able to own up to it and you get into a habit of doing it often, it's also like teaching you like, hey, I can mess up, but I can also apologize, show up for it, and do better next time. And it's kind of like when you allow yourself those moments to express like accountability and to take responsibility for it, you're also allowing yourself to see an example of where you're like, hey, listen, like I've actually messed up here, but my behavior can get better. I can do this. Like I can accept that I've done this. And I think especially for people who are like perfectionists, it's also really great to acknowledge this, because then you start to realize like, I'm actually human. I'm going to make mistakes. And I'm not justifying my mistakes because I'm human, but I'm just saying like, I'm going to make errors, and those don't define me. And I'm not going to beat down on myself so much, because I'm getting better at taking responsibility for them and at understanding what the consequences are of my actions, and rather than avoiding them. And I think in that sense, you definitely are able to build up more emotional resilience. Now, I said that I kind of like the idea that maybe this is a bit messed up internally. I don't think it's actually messed up, but I like this sense that it kind of does create like some internal conflict, and also I think it leads to a lot of guilt sometimes, especially when you're not able to take responsibility for a while. I don't like it because it makes you beat down on yourself, but it's like a pain point, I guess, where that guilt that you have for not accepting, what's happened, and the guilt that you have for avoiding it, I think that also allows you to be like, when you're sitting with so much discomfort, the best thing to do sometimes is honestly to face it head on, at least for me personally. So this could be just like a personal point where it's just like, I know that I'll mess up with people, and I know sometimes I also tend to avoid things, or I'll also be in denial, or I'll get really defensive. But I also know like what pushes me sometimes to like more than the actual logical reasons, quote unquote, that pushes me to take accountability for my actions are when I still feel that guilt. Because that guilt like really, I guess it messes personally with my ego, where it's like, but I did this, I know exactly why I did this for these reasons, but okay, Sinead, then why do you feel so guilty still? Like what's on your chest? And that guilt and those like sometimes negative emotions, they do honestly make me reflect and be like, Sinead, be honest with yourself. You hurt this person. I understand you can justify it. I understand you can get defensive with it. And maybe you've already done this, but like, that's not helping the situation. And that's honestly sometimes what makes me go back into certain conversations. And that's what makes me be like, you know what? You're right. I did mess up and I'm sorry. And yes, it does help get rid of the guilt, but it also helps to amend that bond with the person, which is, I think, even more important for me, especially as someone who's trying to recover from an anxious attachment style. So like, it's kind of really weird, like, yeah, because I'm really needy sometimes. So it kind of just helps sometimes also to push me in the right direction when it comes to talking to people, like, and owning up to my own mistakes. Now, how do we overcome this, and how can we accept responsibility? First of all, we need to reframe our mind on what it means to take accountability. We can't be seeing this as something that's meant to punish us, but rather something that's meant to help us to grow. And this is generally the thing of just like, be more optimistic about it, Because the thing is, you will be making mistakes throughout your life, and it's about how you handle those mistakes. I don't think anyone's ever going to be 1000% perfect. It's just, am I doing better with it? Am I, seeing the signs faster? Or am I maybe even like curving different patterns before they even start? And that's another thing, like why like this is really important, is that sometimes like we are in such denial with our like patterns and behaviors and stuff that we're not really aware of like how we impact others. And so when we actually take accountability, it's like, hey, like not only have I acknowledged this for myself, but I'm also acknowledging this to you. And so this might even help me curve a pattern before it even begins. And this might help me to make myself even more aware of what are some of the negative things that I do. And when you take accountability, like, again, it's also helping to understand that you're human, and that you can get through this. Like it's just like a normal part of like the human experience. But also, don't avoid it, I guess. And also don't let it don't let it deeply internalize within you, to the point where you think that like you're always going to be a bad person. Because I just think, again, the more you do this, like, and the more repetitive it gets, that the more you see some of your errors, of course, but the more also understanding you have for yourself, and hopefully able to reflect on why you've done certain things. And hopefully, again, you're curving a pattern and you're not doing it. But yeah, that's, I guess, just like a bit about it. Just like, I think reframing what it means. Don't see it as an attack on you. Don't see it as you being weak. See it as you coming up with a solution. See it as you giving space to other people's emotions. See it as you reflecting like on your decisions and how they've impacted other people. And see it as like an aspect of like being selfless. And I think I talk about like self-love and a lot, and in the sense of also being like a bit selfish, but like with this, also it impacts like your community. And I think see it as that rather than see it as someone trying to hurt you. Like, because in this moment you've hurt someone else, and just be able to acknowledge that, like, even though that's really, really hard. And like lastly, what I would say with that, like, even though you don't necessarily want to do it, just ask yourself, what would you want someone, like, if the roles were reversed in that situation, what would you want that person to do? Like, would you want them to avoid it, to be in denial, to be defensive? Like, because I've been in those conversations too, where the other person is like so defensive when I'm telling them like how they've hurt me. And it's just like, this is not going to help. This is not going to help. So we could always reverse it and be like, what would you want from the other person, even though it's hard? And like I said, I think that makes you more emotionally resilient and more emotionally stronger. And now, of course, like I've said, like, you're going to be doing this throughout your entire life. So the goal isn't to, because like you're just going to be hurting people. Oh God, that sounds so bad. But you will be hurting people unintentionally throughout your life. And I think just getting better at the process of taking accountability, and, not being in those phases of denial for too long, or defensiveness for denial for too long, I think that really does help you get better at it. I know for myself, like I still struggle to not be defensive. I think especially when it comes to like really emotional conversations, it's really hard sometimes for me to put my ego aside. Or even when I'm hurt like from something else, like I'm just thinking about myself. But taking accountability, it's not just about you, it's also about the other persons who are involved in that conflict. And I've also mentioned at the beginning of this episode about you then have to also accept the consequences and accept that you can't control what happens after you take accountability and you apologize. And for me, I've noticed myself, like, I want to nag the person so much after. Like, I want to nag the person so much and be like, hey, but like, we're good now, right? Or like, what do you need so I can, like, what do you need me to do so that this goes away faster? And And that's another part of the process, is just like being able to sit down with the fact that like, okay, you kind of have to wait it out at that point. Like, know that you've done like everything in your power. Know that hopefully it was a genuine apology. Hopefully you've genuinely like understood what happened, and hopefully it's also you genuinely saying like, okay, I'm taking accountability, not just so that this can go away, but because like I'm actually like, I understand why I've hurt you and I don't want to do that. And then afterwards, it's just this thing of, kind of waiting it out, and like you don't have control of that, but you do have control of being able to say like, hey, I messed up, and apologizing with that. So this is not an easy process. It is something that we will always have to do, because we will always be in situations where either things are misread, maybe we're high on different emotions, maybe we just were not having the best time that day, or we just wanted to lash out, and there are always going to be consequences to our actions. And this is not just like, towards you who's listening right now, but this is for everyone. And yes, taking accountability is very difficult, but for the reasons that I've mentioned, and especially like if you're listening to this podcast, I mean, you want to get better in some capacity, and sometimes getting better also means getting better at the harder situations where you can sometimes be at fault. And so I guess the question I want you guys to ask yourself about this, and honestly, please even leave like comments below, because I also have a hard time, not doing the following. I want you guys to ask yourself, how can I take responsibility without beating myself up, without kind of internalizing it to the point where you just think like, I'm just a terrible person. Like, I can never get back from this. Like, this is all that there is to me. Ask yourself, how can I take responsibility without beating myself up? And feel free to let me know in the comments. Thank you guys so much for this week's episode. Hey guys, thank you so much for supporting this week's episode of the Uncomfortable Podcast. Make sure to tune in every Monday for a new episode on Spotify and YouTube, and go check out our TikTok and Instagram for more content.